Susannah's fear of her father is soon to be surpassed by the fear of the malevolent presence that looms in the village. Hi, my name is Char, and this is the And Other Stories podcast, where I read stories of the supernatural and criminal, both real and fictional, works of fiction written by me. Superstitions. She walked with a silent tread, demure and slow, her head down, not making eye contact, especially with any men. Her skirts dragged on the muddy ground, sodden from the heavy rainfall of this damp autumn, making sure not even her leather-bound feet showed beyond the hem. Father was beginning a crusade against evil and sin, so she must be seen to be setting an example. But Susannah needn't have worried. People scurried away at the mere sight of her. Men grasped their wives by the elbow and steered them off the main street, avoiding their path. They were scared of her, all because of Father. It had only been 6 weeks since they had packed up their meagre belongings into a cart and made the 6-day journey to this small village. The cardinal had chosen her father personally for this post. He had heard of his writings and was eager for him to spread the word of the Catholic Church to this rural part of the country. There had been rumours. A woman did not attend church on a Sunday, another who would inflict illnesses on any who crossed her. There were many witnesses. After holding counsel with the men of the village, the raids began. 6 women were interrogated. 4 of them showed the mark of the devil. The other 2 refused to comply with any reasonable request, therefore proving their guilt. They were hanged in the square as witches. Pulling her mud-laden skirts behind her, she hoisted her basket closer to her as if she could hide behind it. The street had mostly emptied, and on market day, the busiest day of the week, a couple of the stalls had packed up and left at the sight of her. This was highly inconvenient, as she did need to stock the larder with some more of her father's favourites. His temper had become very precarious of late. After a stop at the baker, who barely said hello and goodbye, she wandered along to the far end of the street where one stall still stood. An old woman sat behind her goods. A cat sat alongside her, both staring with emotionless faces at her. The cat's tail flicked back and forth. "Good day," Susannah said, her gaze flickering to the woman's face for only a moment. The woman gave only a curt nod. As Susannah looked down at what the woman was offering for sale, she quickly shook her head. "Oh," she uttered softly. "Oh no, no thank you," she almost whispered, as she quickly turned away. The woman had a messy gathering of bottles and jars with various ointments and healing potions contained within. This would not do. This was highly suspicious behaviour. She must report this to her father, and quickly. She glanced back to the woman and saw her pulling at her high collar, exposing a glimpse of a large mole on her neck. Susannah gasped loudly. The old woman quickly let go of her collar and stared right into Susannah's eyes, holding her gaze like a magnet. Susannah tore her eyes away and started off as fast as her sodden skirts would allow her, but just as she reached the opposite corner of the main street, her wrist was locked in a cold vice grip, and she was jerked backwards. She spun in shock to find herself face to face with the woman healer. They stared at one another for several moments, Susannah breathing hard in her fear and shock. How had the woman reached her so fast? Just when the grip on her wrist became so tight Susannah could no longer bear it, the woman's face slowly expanded into a wide grin, her brown teeth bared, her sunken cheeks stretched tight and painful looking, her cold eyes unchanging. She raised her other wasted, aged hand and placed it into Susannah's numb, imprisoned hand, and when she finally released her, she had left a flower in her palm. A small, delicate flower with 5 petals and lilac in colour. Confused, Susannah held onto the flower as the woman, hunched and limping, made her way slowly back to her stall, leaving Susannah wondering once more how she had reached her so quickly. She looked down at the flower in her hand. The woman must simply have been trying to put her at ease, to soothe the uneasiness that she had clearly felt at the sight of her goods. It was the first time anyone in the village had shown her what she presumed was kindness. As she raised the flower to her nose, she noticed it had a particularly pungent smell, which was familiar but she could not remember from where. As she again set off to turn the corner of the street and walk home, she turned back towards the direction of the stall. It was gone, along with the old woman. She was familiar now with walking into an empty house. Her father worked tirelessly for the church and was often gone most evenings. She changed her dress, put the food away in the larder, and started to prepare the evening meal. As a homely touch, she decided to put the flour in a small vase of water and place it on the table. When all was prepared, she sat at the table and waited for her father, her head bowed and her hands folded on her lap. He came bursting through the door with no warning. She jumped at the noise, but otherwise made no motion to acknowledge his entrance. She would speak when she was spoken to. He made no gesture of welcome towards her, but went swiftly upstairs to change, and came back to the table to sit with a heavy thump and a groan. The prayer for their food was followed simply by quiet eating. Susannah's mind wandered while they ate. She would take a walk to the woods tomorrow. There were bound to be berries at this time of year, especially in a small clearing she had found at the... Her only warning was the sweeping crash of the vase being knocked from the table before the back of her father's hand flew into her face, sending her crashing to the floor also, small dots of light flashing before her eyes. "What blasphemy is this?" He gestured wildly towards the vase he had thrown to the floor, smashing small shards of porcelain across the stone, one of their few fine things. When she didn't answer, she was still too dazed. He dragged her by her hair to the violet flower that lay dripping on the floor. I was given it, father, in the market today," she said, probing the inside of her lip with her tongue and tasting blood. "Mandrake!" he shouted. "Who gave this to you? I demand you tell me immediately." "The healer," she cried quickly, hoping to avoid another beating. "The healer in the market, the old woman. She came to me and gave it to me. I did not speak to her. I only took the flower from her." Without another word, her father roughly tore his cloak from the peg by the door and was gone. The next morning, Susannah rose before sunrise, dressing modestly, making sure her neck and head were entirely covered. She quietly performed her chores, made bread, and cleaned with no noise so she would not wake her father. When he rose for breakfast, she sat quietly at the table as he ate, making sure she turned her head so she would not show the dark bruise that was blossoming over her jaw and cheekbone. He swept out of the front door without a word, and she breathed freely once more. The crushing silence and her fearful memories of the evening before were choking her. She needed to be far away from this house. Gathering a basket and her warmest cloak, she left without a backward glance. The air had turned cold, and the last days of summer had long since disappeared. Although there were still leaves on the trees, foliage on the ground, they had turned and cast magnificent displays of colour across the village and surrounding countryside. Susannah breathed in deeply, the sharp chill with a festering undercurrent of dying plants. They were saying it would be another hard winter. Well, the men did. The women would not dare make predictions on the seasons to come. She planned to just skip up the side of the village, passing the main street on its very far end, hoping to avoid any people in the square at the other end of the street. Passing through the old washerwoman's garden as a shortcut, she was just closing the gate behind her when her ears registered a strange sound. There was some sort of commotion occurring in the town. Angry voices leapt and pitched in harmonies of rage as they travelled nearer then farther from where she stood. Susannah had no wish to discover the reason for this. The only other times she had heard such things were when her father had been involved, the purging of the evil of the village. She paused behind the wall of the cottage she had just passed, the last cottage before she reached the main street. Steeling herself and holding her breath, she walked steadily and directly toward the gate to the fields, just past the village, crossing the street as she did so. Before she had reached the safety of her destination, she felt an unconscious urge to look up, as if someone had called her name, although she had heard nothing. Her eyes darted up involuntarily and saw in the far distant square a sight to make her blood run cold. A makeshift gallows and noose, on the end of which the healer woman's neck was tightly bound. Her cold blue eyes were looking straight into Susannah's, the ghost of a wicked smile teasing her lips. Susannah tore her eyes away and broke into a run, reaching the gates with a gasp. At exactly that moment she heard a clunk and a snap, and the cheers of the townspeople. She half walked, half ran over the field to the edge of the woods, the cold air aching in her lungs. The sweat on her brow felt cold and clammy. Her stomach heaved. She took several breaths to calm herself, wiping her head with her handkerchief. She walked on. The mundane task of picking berries should be soothing, she thought. She kept close to the edge of the woods. Her nerves would not allow her to go any further into the darkness. She found plenty to forage just inside the hedgerows, and her thoughts were soon occupied by searching and picking. She had been working for a short while when she reached too quickly into the bush and tore a cut into the inside of her wrist. The blood started to flow freely. She jerked her arm back quickly and then attempted to stem the flow with her handkerchief. As she was doing this, she watched as the blood dripped onto the ground, where something else caught her eye. At first she thought it was a child's toy, a rudimentary doll made of sticks and lichen, but with no head and red in spots where her blood had fallen on it. She bent to pick it up, and as she held it, she started to feel strange. The woods started to seem closer, then far away, as her sight bent and twisted. Her hand suddenly felt red hot, and she threw the stick figure to the floor. She bowed her head, and her sight slowly returned to normal. Her hand, although sore from the cut, felt normal once more too. A reaction to the cut, she told herself, a silly weakness of mind over injuring herself. She moved on, the handkerchief wrapped tightly. She had gone only a few more steps when she again saw a stick figure, even more crudely crafted than the last. A small scrap of material wrapped around one of the stick arms, stained red. She looked around her. No one was in sight. She looked through the trees. Nothing but darkness. Her uneasiness grew. She had a half-full basket. That would have to do for now. She could make do with what she had in the larder at home. She turned back the way she had just come, and just as she raised her head to her previous path, she almost walked into a third stick figure. In the place she had just walked not seconds before. It was hanging from a branch by its stick neck. She dropped the basket and ran back to the village. At her garden gate, Susannah stopped to catch her breath. If father was in there, it would not do to let him see her in this state. She smoothed her cap, the front of her dress and cloak. Steadily and quietly she walked into the house. All was quiet and as it had been. Her breath came out as a loud exhalation, as if she had been holding it in for a long time. However, almost immediately afterwards, she drew in a great gasp of shock as something darted past her feet. It was so fast that she only saw it was small and dark. Her heart pounded and she backed up against the wall, her hand groping for the broom that stood a few feet away. She grasped it tightly to her, her eyes roving the floor for the creature. As she saw nothing, she started to inch out into the room. The silence was broken suddenly by a hiss. Susannah jumped and turned toward the source of the noise. Sitting on top of the table sat the healer's cat. Its eyes calm and locked on hers, its tail flicking back and forth. It must be lost, surely. She knew the fate of its owner. It had nowhere to go. But how had it ended up here? Warily she moved toward the cat, broom in hand, intending to usher it out the door. She was only a short distance away from it, when, with no warning, the cat leapt at her with a hiss, digging its claws deep into her uninjured wrist, leaving 3 large open wounds. Susannah grasped her wrist and turned to see where the cat was behind her, but it was gone. She searched the small room and moved to the door. She found it closed and locked, just as she had left it when she left this morning, and just as she had shut and locked it when she had returned. The wounds must be cleaned, this she knew. She drew a basin of water from the well bucket she had collected in the early morning, and drew her sleeves up higher. That was when she saw them. On each arm, a dark, oddly shaped blemish, about the size of a thumbnail. Panic crawled up her throat. She knew what they were. They were considered the mark of the devil. If her father saw this, his punishment would be swift and brutal. She would be tried and would not have a hope of redemption. This was undeniable evidence of witchcraft. Susannah quickly drew her sleeves back down. Rushing to her chamber, she changed her clothes, covering up the marks. He must never see them. She fought to keep her breathing steady. Her hands shook and it felt as though ice had covered her heart. She must make plans. She could keep it hidden from her father for now, and when the time was right, she could leave in the middle of the night and never come back. She would not suffer the same fate as those other women. During their evening meal, Susannah strove to maintain a calm exterior. Her father, no doubt his mood elevated by the successful trial of the morning, talked endlessly about the business of the village. The men who did his bidding and revered him, the women who now obeyed their husbands quietly, all thanks to his control over the village. Susannah, however, did not listen to much. The marks on her arms, whether through her intense fear of discovery or some affliction, itched incessantly, which then turned to a burn. Her father finally stopped to stare at her when he saw that she was not listening, and sat rigid and tense in her chair. He eyed her suspiciously, not saying a word. Her panic grew to a climax when she saw how he scrutinized her. "Well?" he barked. "Speak, daughter." I'm sorry, father," she stuttered. "I am not well. I must retire to my chamber." He sat, spoon raised in one hand, his other hand resting on his thigh, as she held her breath in anticipation of his rage. After several long minutes of praising her, he seemed to give up, and with an impatient wave of his hand dismissed her. She tried to rise slowly, but sent her own spoon clattering to the floor. His eyes followed her suspiciously as she stooped to retrieve it, set it on the table once more, and with a small bend of her knee and bow of her head, she moved swiftly to the door, feeling her father's stern gaze all the way. She lay on her bed, fully clothed, watching the room darken more and more, the candle burning down to a stump. Her fears of her father battled furiously with her fears of all she had encountered today. The menacing stare of the condemned woman, the stick figures appearing in front of her, the marks on her arms, the beast in her home. The feeling she still had now that she was not completely alone. She could come to only one conclusion. She must flee, far from this village, perhaps to another country. She could take her belongings, as few as they were, and find another place where... Her head swam. The room sparked with light. Red licked up the walls of her bedchamber, reflecting off the wooden furniture. She was not sure if she had fallen asleep. There was a dreamlike, unreal quality to everything. Suddenly she felt like she could not breathe. A great weight was pressing on her chest and her wrists burned with more intensity than ever. She felt her body arch off the bed and then slam back again, knocking any remaining air from her lungs. Everything was hazy and out of focus. Then, just as suddenly, silence and stillness once more. The only sound was Susannah's ragged, panicked breathing. She dared not move. A creak of a floorboard from her left, a brush of material from her right. "Father?" Her voice trembled, but there was only silence. Then, hovering directly above her face, two gleaming, cold steel eyes and a bright, manic grin shone in the darkness. She opened her mouth to scream. Her vision skewed once more, and everything was black. She awoke. She tried to move her hands, her legs, but she could feel nothing. In her seated position, she frantically moved her eyes from right to left in the dim light. She was in a small, windowless room, roughly dug into the earth. A small, rotting hatch in one wall, a candle glowing dimly. Water filled the room, covering her naked body up to her waist. A huge silhouette loomed in front of her. A mound of figures piled on top of one another, their eyes staring lifelessly to the ceiling, wide and terrified, their skin shredded and bloody. She tried to scream, but there was only silence. Thank you for listening. I hope you liked it. My name is Char, and this is the And Other Stories podcast. See you next time.